I'm Chad, and you're watching Squarebody Stuff. Well, welcome back to the channel, everybody. Hope you're having some good weather in your part of the country, because right now, in my part of the country, it's a little nasty. Of course, I've got a good fire going in the shop stove. We got some heat out here. But man, look at that outside. Yeah. It's a winter wonderland. Sure is pretty though. What do you think, Tex? Tex has actually been enjoying sitting outside in the sun. He hasn't really wanted in the shop today. Actually, this weather is improving because it's above 30 degrees now outside. That snow is melting off. We had about 6 inches of snow yesterday. Earlier in the week, we had about ½ inch of ice, which was still on the trees and everything before the snow came. And the last week and a half before, well, yesterday it got up in high 20s. But before that, the last week and a half, it's been down in the teens here in southern Missouri. So weather's been, it's been winter. And we get the best of both worlds here in southern Missouri. You know, wintertime we get down to teens, sometimes the zeros or the single digits, and sometimes below zero. And then in the summertime, we get above the, well into the triple digits. So yeah, it makes it fun. But when it's all kind of nasty and stuff outside and there's nothing better to do, because all my outside chores are done. I've got ice busted on the pond so the cows have water. They've got hay and cows are all set. Everything's all set. We've got everything ready to go. I think in my last video I mentioned that we were getting geared up for all this weather that was impending at that time. Had got my generator, everything ready to go. Fortunately, we didn't need any of that. We never went without power. Everything's been good, so it's actually been kind of an enjoyable winter weather experience. It's been nice to see it. We've still, I don't know if you heard that, but stuff's falling off the roof, ice sliding off of it, snow and everything. But so while it's nasty outside, and I've got everything outside done, we are working on the big block for old cream puff. And if you guys are new to the channel and you're not familiar with what we got going on, this is I think it's an 84 casting, 454 block, 60 over. The rods and mains are 30 on the rods, mains are 20 under. You got a steel crank, a factory steel crank out of a 1 ton. And we've got a lot of goodies going into this thing. It's going to be a nice, conservatively 450, maybe 475 horse engine for cream puff. And if you're not familiar with cream puff, he's chilling outside in the snow. I don't know if he's still got a little snow on him. That's old cream puff sitting over there by the house. And right now, cream puff has got just a mild small block in him with a 270 comp cam in him. Elderbrock Performer RPM intake, not the air gap. And headers, that's about it. I mean, 600 Holly, your standard stuff. It does great. It gets good fuel mileage. It has okay power for what it is, and it's getting a little bit tired. So we're going to build this big block, stick it in cream puff, because he's already got a Turbo 400 transmission in it. So the transmission is good and solid, so we're not going to have any problems there. So now you're all caught up to speed on what it's going in and what we're doing. Our last video on this channel was going over rod bearing, oil clearances, and checking out the rod bearings and the rods, getting them ready, micing the crank and everything for the rods. This video is going to be checking the main bearing oil clearances. Now I've already skipped ahead. I've already got the first, well, not the first, depends on how you count them. That's number 5. I start out with number 5 and work my way forward to get my measurements on the bearings. And I'll be showing you later how I do all that with the, when I put the number 1 main cap on there and the bearings and everything. All of my journals have been measured and stuff on the crankshaft. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you kind of my process, or explain my process and show you a little bit of that, of what I do to measure my main bearing clearances and what I'm looking for, and kind of how I do all that. This is how I do it. Nothing is set in stone. This is not the only way to do stuff, but I'm just going to show you how I do it. Hopefully you can pick something up from that and help you out in your engine building process. Now our crankshaft we have is a 74/16 casting. This is a forged steel crank out of a, it was a C30, it was a 1-ton, 2-wheel drive pickup. This is kind of your standard forged crank that came in a lot of, you know, heavy duty engines, your motorhomes and, you know, heavy duty trucks. Now just kind of go over the steps that I take during this process. Is the first thing I'll do is I'll take my measurements off my crankshaft, and I'll do that with a micrometer. Now I don't have super fancy expensive tools. This is a set of micrometers. It goes through 0 to 6 inch whole set, and I bought them off of probably Amazon or eBay 20 some years ago, and they've worked well for me for all these years. So you don't have to spend a bunch of money on the tools. Now, yeah, that's up to you. So far, these have worked great for me. I don't suggest using, you know, just regular calipers for measuring this kind of stuff. I don't feel they're as accurate as a good set of micrometers. And as far as reading the micrometer, I kind of went over that briefly in my last video, so I'm not going to go over that again. But what I do is I just go to each main journal and I will measure them in 2 or 3 different spots. And hopefully, you know, your crankshaft is good and round. I know this one's already been checked. It's checked by me, checked by the machine shop before they polished it and done all the balancing and everything. So it's good and round. So, but you can check in several different spots just to make sure you're good to go. Even if it's a brand new crankshaft, it's a good idea to do that, because this is the time to find any mistakes or any obstacles, anything that's not quite right. So what I'll do is just go through and measure, get my measurement, and I will write it on the crankshaft. And then I'll also write it on my notebook. And then once I get everything done, I will transfer it to my build sheet, and I'll show you all that here in just a minute. So as you can see, I've got my measurements for the main journals. These measurements are for the rod journals I done in the last video. I went through and measured every main journal, got all of them wrote down. Transfer them to my notebook. And then once I get all this done, like I said, I will transfer it to these papers, which is the build sheet. Now this build sheet or engine data sheet is something I just printed off of the internet. I don't remember where I went. You know, I think I just Googled engine data sheet or engine build sheet, and this came up. Engine power is the name that's on it, but I've used this several times, and it has a lot of stuff on there. Some of it is, I don't really like the way they've got it. I can't remember. Yeah, here they've got for the connecting rods, they've got the small end and pin end, this kind of backwards for you doing your math. But anyways, I switched that around, no big deal. But once I get all my main journal clearances and everything finalized, I'll put it right on here, and that way I have documentation of this engine. Now it's up to you if you want to keep documentation of it. I like to do that because in case something happens with the engine on down the road, especially if you're building something for somebody else. This is for my personal use, but if you're building something for something else or someone else and they have an issue with it and you bring the engine back in, or another case would be you have an engine that's got a lot of miles on it and you bring it back in, or if you're racing every season you want to tear it down and check your tolerances, you have your original tolerances. That way you know what is wearing, what's not wearing, and you just have documentation of what the engine was when it's brand new. Once you get your crankshaft and everything measured out, wrote down, then we can move on to the block and the main bearings. Now the tool I'm going to use to measure the bore of the bearings is the dial bore gauge. Now you could also use the snap gauges or telescopic gauges, however you want to call them, or you could use plastic gauge. Plastic gauge is something I would rather use plastic gauge versus the calipers or anything else, but it's really close to being as accurate as a dial bore gauge, within a little bit. So let's talk about clearances for a second. The rule of thumb, which I went over this in the last video on the connecting rods, the rule of thumb is 1/1000th of an inch per journal diameter. So to make it easy to explain, if you had a 3-inch journal, you would have 0.003 of an inch of clearance. Now that is depending upon what your preferences is, what your application is really for, but that's just kind of a good rule of thumb to get an idea where you could or should be in that ballpark. I would rather have a little bit extra bearing clearance or oil clearance than having it too tight, because if you have it too tight, if you have an overheating issue or any type of an issue, you have less room for error, less room for anything to, if anything goes wrong, you have less room for anything to happen. If you have more clearance, more tolerance, then you have more of a cushion there of your oil film. Now, obviously, you can go too far, too much, but it all depends on your preferences and the application. So far, this journal has 46 10/1000ths of clearance, or a little over 4.5 thousandths. And this was 37, 39, and the rear one is 55. All right, so if you're worried about it being too much, let's put this into perspective. Even at 55 10/1000ths or 5.5 thousandths, divide that by 2. That's what, 2.75 or 2 3/4 thousandths of an inch on each side of that journal. That's how much oil film you have in between that. It's not a whole lot. I think the thickness of a piece of paper is around 3 to 4 thousandths. So just to kind of put that in perspective. Now I'm going to go ahead and put these bearing halves in, put that main cap on, torque it down, and show you how I use the dial bore gauge. Not a whole lot to that. Snap your bearing in. Then we'll take our main cap, install our bearing, and set it in the block. Now I've got my ARP main bolts all lubed up, ready to go. I do not suggest using any type of power tools for this. It's just not a good place to use it. It's got one of these speed wrenches, whatever you want to call them. That's what I've always called them. Make sure it's good and seated. Now for these particular bolts, ARP calls for 100 foot-pounds as the finished torque, and I like to go in, they suggest 3 steps, but I like to go in 4 steps. Start out with 25, then go to 50, 75, and then 100. There's 50. $75. And 100. The measurements for this bore are supposed to be around 2.7, 2.9. That's what the books call for. But I went ahead and set my dial bore gauge to 2.730. Or 2 inches, 730 thousandths. That way, got a nice round number to start with. And then I will go on my bore gauge and see what I've got. I'm not sure how good you could see that. But with the bore gauge, you want to get it in there, move it up and down, and where the needle stops and it starts going back, that is your measurement. Let me go to the other side of the oil groove, see what we got. Okay, we're looking, I mean, it's just a touch over, but we're looking at about 27315, maybe just a hair over. We'll call it 27315. And as it turns out, that's what the rest of them come out to be, except for the number 5. It came out to 27320. So half thousandths, if you want to call it that. Bigger, not a big deal. Now my marker's not wanting to mark. Okay. Alright, so I've got the 2.7315 wrote down. Now we'll do the math. You can do it in your head if you want, but I'm not very good at math in my head, even with these simple numbers. Minus 2.7315 minus 2.7266, which is our journal size, and we've got 0.0049. And again, that may seem a little excessive. It is a little bit looser than what I would like, but it's not so loose that I'm worried about it. If this would have been something that my machine shop had done, I would probably said something about it. But their end of stuff, which was machining the block, come out fine. This crankshaft, all they did was polish it. They did take the measurements. They did let me know before they proceeded with anything, the balancing or anything like that, that the journals were kind of not consistent. But he said they were true and round, just not very consistent. So my tolerances or my clearances may be kind of have a little variation. And I told them, don't worry about it. I'll figure it out when I get there. So now we're figuring out, we're there. I'm fine with it. All right, I'm gonna transfer these numbers to my data sheet and we'll move on to checking the thrust clearance on the crankshaft. And to do that, I'll have to pull all the main casts back off, lube up the bearings, and put the crankshaft in, torque it all down, and I'll show you all that here in just a second. So now what we need to do to check our thrust clearance is, you really don't even need these caps in there. Just your number 5 is the one you really need. But I've just torqued it down to 25 foot-pounds for right now. And then I will take a pry bar just to kind of get a little pressure and smack the back of the crank with a hammer, rubber hammer preferably, just to get that bearing pushed as far forward as it can go. Now the reason you want it forward, or the way I like it forward, is because if you have a manual transmission, when you push the clutch in, it's pushing against the crankshaft. Now if this bearing is set towards back, whenever you push that clutch in over time, it may try to shove it forward. It's not where it needs to be. It needs to be pushed forward before you torque the cap down. Even with an automatic, your torque converter expands a little bit, so it puts pressure on it. So drive your crankshaft forward, get that set, then you can torque your cap down and we'll take our measurement. After you get torqued down, just gently pry your crankshaft back a little bit, and you could use a feeler gauge to go down in between and check your clearance. Let's see, let's go with 5 or 6. Let's go with 5, see what we got. Now this is one way to do it, but of course I've got, hold on, let me get a blade that's straight. I don't normally check this with the feeler gauge. I just want to show you how you can check it with the feeler gauge if that's what you got. But just right in there, you can see the bearing surface on this side and then your thrust surface on that side. It's also called crankshaft end play. This 7 moves in and out. I mean, it's real close to that. Let me show you how I like to do it. Let me get my trusty crusty old dial indicator on here, and get it set up on the front of the crankshaft. And you can either pry it forward or pry it back. It really doesn't matter. Pry it backwards. Set my dial indicator to 0. And I'll pry it forward. Man, right at 7. And you'll have to excuse my dial indicator. That old dial is it's been through some stuff. So anyhow, we're well within tolerance. 10 thousandths is, you know, at the end of it. You can maybe run a little bit more. That's kind of another one of those things. It's up to you, but we're good on our thrust or end play, crankshaft end play. Crankshaft is good to go. Tolerances are acceptable by my standards, maybe not by yours, and that's fine. But they're acceptable by my standards for what we're doing with it. So we're going to end this thing off. Hopefully you guys have learned something, and don't beat me up too bad in the comments for my how loose I am on my tolerances. You know, it is what it is. I'm okay with it. Anyhow, thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, try to keep them mostly positive or constructive. Again, I'm not going to argue or debate anybody in the comment section. I just don't do that. It just don't do any good for anybody. So, but feel free to put your thoughts in the comments below, and we may have a good discussion about it. But anyhow, I think I've covered everything that I know about the subject, and this is how I do it. And the next thing we'll be doing is probably start checking our piston clearance, ring end gap, and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. That way you get notifications of whenever I put out new videos. We'll be moving forward on this engine in the next video. So until then, y'all keep your square bodies rolling, and we'll catch you later.